I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we bring you the latest news as Ukrainian troops weather further attacks across the front lines. Ukraine claims an Atacms strike on an airbase in occupied Crimea, and we examine how Ukraine is decentralizing its energy infrastructure in the wake of punishing Russian strikes.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday the 26th of July, 2 years and 158 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our assistant comment editor Francis Dearnley, Berlin correspondent JamesRothwell, and Telegraph contributor and former tank commander Hamish de Bretton-Gordon. I started by summarising the latest news from Ukraine. Let's start in Ukraine, where Russia overnight attacked Ukrainian energy facilities in 2 regions with drones, disrupting energy and electricity supplies. Kyiv's Air Force claimed to have destroyed 20 out of the 22 Russian attack drones launched overnight. Most of the drones were shot down in the Kherson, Sumy, Zhytomyr and Chernihiv regions. Power supplies have, however, been restored to most consumers in the northern Chernihiv and Zhytomyr regions. This is coming from Ukraine's national power grid operator, Ukrenergo. The governor of the Chernihiv region said that some infrastructure and a dormitory were damaged during the attack on the town of Nizhin without giving further details. The emergency services said an overnight attack on Kherson had damaged 6 residential buildings and caused significant fires in open areas. Russian missile and drone attacks on Ukraine's energy sector have intensified since the spring, resulting in blackouts across many regions and forcing Kyiv to start large-scale electricity imports from the EU. On the front lines, the Ukrainian news agency Ukrinform has the latest. They write, as many as 147 combat engagements with Russian invaders were recorded on the front lines in the past 24 hours, the fighting being heaviest in the Pokrovsk sector in Donbass. Just to give you a sense of just how heavy the fighting has been, Ukrinform record that across the front on July the 25th, Russian forces launched 1 missile strike against Ukrainian positions and populated areas, using 1 missile and 90 airstrikes and 151 guided aerial bombs. In addition, the enemy launched, this is still Ukrinform talking, launched more than 4,900 shelling attacks, including 104 multiple rocket launcher attacks. In reply, Ukrainian combat aircraft and missile and artillery forces launched 17 strikes on Russian troop concentrations, hitting 3 defence systems, an artillery piece and a cannon. Next, explosions were reported near Russia's Saki airfield in occupied Crimea after an apparent Ukrainian Atacms missile and drone attack. Witnesses described hearing the powerful sound of detonating ammunition at the military base in the early hours of Friday morning. After the initial explosions, secondary detonations could be heard, suggesting that ammunition was cooking off and exploding after the first hit. Astra, a Russian Telegram channel, said that Ukraine had fired 4 US-donated Atacms missiles, citing emergency services sources. The channel also claimed a missile had hit an air defence location about 3 miles from the airfield, destroying a radar station. Saki military airbase is the home of Russia's 43rd Naval Assault Regiment. Its Su-30 and Su-24 fighter jets are regularly used to carry out strikes on Ukraine. Fighter Bomber, a Telegram channel with links to Russia's Air Force, shared a cryptic message after the strikes, saying, quote, eternal memory. Ukraine, just to remind ourselves, has heavily targeted Crimea for months now in a bid to drive Moscow's forces out of the highly strategic peninsula. Next, Romania said it had confirmed that fragments of a Russian drone entered its territory 1 day after Russia targeted Ukraine with a bombardment of 38 long-range drones. Ukraine's Air Force said that 3 of the drones were, quote, lost after crossing the state border with Romania on Wednesday. NATO said it saw no sign of a deliberate act of aggression towards the alliance's territory, but called such acts by Moscow, quote, irresponsible. While NATO has no information indicating any intentional attack by Russia against Allied territory, these acts are irresponsible and potentially dangerous. That's a spokesman said in a NATO statement. It added that NATO had increased its presence in the Black Sea region in recent days. Moving to the US now. The Pentagon can send military aid worth another $2 billion, that's £1.4 billion, to Ukraine after it found accounting errors in its calculations for ammunition, missiles and other equipment already sent to Kyiv. It takes the total of improperly valued material to $8.2 billion, a US government report revealed on Thursday. The US Department of Defense has faced challenges in accurately valuing defense articles sent to Ukraine. In 2023, the Pentagon said staff had used replacement value instead of depreciative value to calculate the billions in materials sent to Ukraine. The $6.2 billion error created, therefore, a path for billions more to be sent to Kyiv. Now, another $2 billion more in overstatements has been found. As a result, arms worth an additional $2 billion can be sent to Ukraine to cover the amount of aid approved by the Biden administration. Certainly a story we need to dig into more, and I think we probably need some expert support in that one. In Russia, Russia's parliament has approved an amendment that will allow commanders to punish soldiers using their mobile phones on the front line. The decision was passed to stop the transmission of any information via phones or navigation devices that could be used to identify Russian troops and their location. The new law states any possession of a device that allows military personnel to store or send video, photos or geolocation data on the internet is punishable by up to 15 days imprisonment. Ukraine has previously been using videos shared by Russian soldiers to help locate troop positions across occupied territory. Our final story, and one that must be taken with all the appropriate caveats, and of course we'll continue to bring you updates on it as it develops. Russian state news has broadcast a video of a Russian citizen confessing to blowing up a military officer in a car bombing in Moscow on apparent orders from Ukraine's spy agency. The handcuffed man, whose Russia's FSB security service named as Yevgeny Serebryakov, had been brought to Russia from Turkey and handed over to investigators. In the video, published by Russian outlet RIA, the man claimed he was told to carry out Wednesday's attack by an officer of Ukraine's SBU that he met in Istanbul. Several Russian news outlets named Andrei Torgashov and his wife as the two victims of the bombing, which was filmed on CCTV and showed a parked Toyota Land Cruiser exploding into a fireball. The alleged intelligence officer, who Russian media reported was on Ukraine's online target list, lost his feet in the explosion while the woman received shrapnel wounds. Mr. Serebryakov said he had been recruited by Ukrainian intelligence last year and asked to, quote, kill an officer with a homemade car bomb. He was promised Ukrainian citizenship and $10,000 to $20,000 as a reward for his work, he claimed. There's been no immediate comment from Ukraine on the claims, and just a reminder, we need to take all of that with a rather large pinch of salt. We've heard the Russian state media explanation, and we don't have any corresponding evidence, but I do think it's important to bring you that version of the news because that's what they want us to hear. Well, those are all the updates from Ukraine. James Rothwell, can I come to you next? There's been a huge story emerging in France that you've been looking at. Can you bring us up to date on developments in France ahead of the opening ceremony of the 2024 Paris Olympics?
Yes, thanks, and good afternoon, everyone. The French Prime Minister has pledged to find and punish those responsible for this massive attack on the country's high-speed rail network earlier today, just ahead of the opening of the Paris Olympics. Quite a strange attack, this. It looks to be an attack that involved some arson elements, setting on fire signal services around the rail network and also cutting cables in order to essentially paralyze the whole network. And officials in France are suggesting that this was carried out by individuals who had quite a sophisticated knowledge of the French transport system. Now, what we don't know is who actually carried out this attack. No state or non-state actor has yet claimed responsibility, but some, if you like, prime suspects are emerging. Earlier this morning, when the attack happened, lots of people pointing the finger at Russia. And there is, of course, form here. Russia, as we know, is waging a hybrid warfare campaign on Europe. That's linked to the war in Ukraine. It's an attempt to launch sabotage attacks, assassinations, arson attacks, any way really of destabilizing European NATO members. And the French President, Emmanuel Macron, had in fact spoken openly in the run-up to the Olympics about concerns that Russia may well be trying to disrupt it. But I must stress, Russia has not claimed responsibility for this attack on the rail system in France. And as the morning progressed, more theories started to emerge about who may have been behind it. Israel Katz, the Israeli foreign minister, has claimed that it was actually Iran. He also claims that Israel has intelligence backing up that claim, although we haven't seen it. Iran, of course, and Israel have been locked in a kind of shadow war for many years. And in fairness, Iran has launched cyber attacks on infrastructure targeting Israeli assets, which bear some superficial similarities, perhaps, to what's happened in France today. And another emergent theory, and this is one that's been put out there actually by French intelligence sources speaking anonymously to AFP, the French news agency, is that it may have been launched by some kind of far-left radical group that they have formed for targeting infrastructure in France in the past. And one could theorize perhaps that a French radical leftist group that's based in France is perhaps more likely to have people on the ground sympathetic to their cause who work in, or at least have a sophisticated understanding of, the French rail system. So we've got three possibilities for where this attack may have came from. They're not the only ones. There may have been a terror element to it instead. The bottom line is that for the time being, we don't know who did it. And the French government is, for the time being, urging people not to speculate too heavily on this. Mr. Macron has declined to comment. And I think with the disruption to the trains set to continue all the way through the weekend, it's going to be a long investigation. It may also turn into one of those investigations that fails to bring, at the very end of it, a clear perpetrator. So we will just have to wait and see.
Well, thank you so much, James, for jumping on and joining us there. I think it was important to get you on just to talk us through that story, if indeed investigations progress and it turns out to be linked in some way to Russia. But as you said, we have to be very careful and say that at the minute there's no evidence pointing to any particular group or state, and investigations are ongoing. Thank you so much, James, for joining us. Francis, can I come to you next? What are the other diplomatic and political developments that we should be aware of?
Well, thanks, David. Even if this sabotage of the Paris Olympics is not the responsibility of the Russians, I think it is worth just reflecting on the other methods that we do know the Kremlin is adopting in response to the Games, namely a torrent of disinformation, cyber attack threats, and the staging, of course, of its own fake Games. The Olympics are a target, it's just worth reminding listeners, because only 15 athletes from Russia will attend this Olympics in competing under a neutral status. So, of course, Russia itself has been banned as an entity, and those athletes who are competing from Russia are obliged to do so as neutral entrants. So, and as I say, there are far fewer of them, although, of course, from some, even that small number is too many. Now, the Financial Times published an interesting piece on this subject of Russia's attitude to the Games. It wrote in detail about the BRICS Games held last month, which attracted only a few thousand athletes from Brazil, India, China and South Africa, and a few other dozen countries. Russia's isolation was powerfully symbolised when synchronised swimmer Alexander Meltsev, the sole competitor in the freestyle programme, received his gold medal while standing alone on the podium, it said. Locked out of the Games, Moscow has also been building up a disinformation campaign about the Games. Tech group Microsoft warned Russian influencers were deploying artificial intelligence to denigrate the reputation of the International Olympic Committee and creating the expectation of violence at the tournament. The Kremlin dismissed this report as absolute slander. So a few interesting remarks there from the Financial Times' investigation into this. Now, related to that specific subject, earlier the FBI Director Christopher Wray said that a Russian government-linked AI bot farm was posing as US persons on social media to spread narratives, especially about the Ukraine war, in order to sow discord. So this is not some conspiracy that we're diving into here. We've got the most senior figures in intelligence talking about it at length, not just the FBI. This week, we've of course had the head of GCHQ talking about it here in Britain, MI6 as well, about the efforts by Russia to sow disinformation. As we've discussed many times on the podcast, we ourselves here at the Telegraph see how the bot farms swarm over our content when we publish especially sensitive material. And of course, our listeners on YouTube have put up with waves of them when we publish at scheduled times. Though funnily enough, the bots don't appear if we publish at unusual ones. It's almost as if someone has clocked off for a vodka break somewhere. But I digress. The other good piece on this subject of hybrid warfare and the Olympics was the one that Joe Barnes discussed yesterday by The Insider on the French chef arrested on suspicion of working for Russian intelligence to disrupt the Games, which also looked at other recent incidents in Paris intended to destabilise more broadly. I recommend that piece because it goes into a lot more granular detail exactly how it seems these agents are being operated, and indeed the people that they are liaising with, the kind of networks that they are tapped into. I think we can expect a lot of references, explicit or not, in this Games about what is happening in Ukraine. I think we can expect references from athletes talking about what the Games represent in terms of peace, and indeed, of course, Ukrainian flags being waved in the crowds. It is a shocking fact that 487 Ukrainian athletes have been killed since Russia began its war. Now, we'll have to see what the reaction to all of this is and whether there are other attempts of sabotage at the opening ceremony tonight. The French will, of course, want to nip it in the bud. There is a fair bit of anxiety about these Games, I think it's fair to say, mirroring the general concern in Europe at the moment. And just to give a flavour of that, echoing similar plans being drawn up in countries like Poland, as we've reported, Lithuanian authorities are apparently drawing up plans for mass evacuations of civilians in case of an armed conflict. That's coming from the LRT public broadcaster, citing the country's interior ministry. Quite an extraordinary story, this. So the Lithuanian Interior Ministry said last month, and indeed is developing now, as I say, that it wants municipalities to be able to relocate a quarter of the country's population of 2.9 million. Priority would be given to families with young children, pregnant women and people with disabilities. And they said they would also include international transfers in the hope that neighbouring countries would be able to lend a hand. Civic preparedness measures, of course, have been under review in Latvia and Estonia. And indeed, we've also talked, as I say, about what's going on in Poland at the moment. The fact that such measures are even being discussed, even if still only preparing for the very, very worst case scenarios, and I emphasise that, not the most likely ones, is indicative of this sense of anxiety at the moment on Europe's eastern flank. Now, in other news, I've reported the last couple of days on discussions between the Chinese and Ukrainians in Beijing, and it's just, I think, worth us taking a moment to look at the former China's conversations with Russia's other allies. Both Moscow and Beijing's foreign ministers are meeting their Southeast Asian counterparts after vowing to counter extra-regional forces a day before Washington's top diplomats due to arrive. Wang Yi and Sergei Lavrov are attending the 3-day meeting of the 10-member association of the ASEAN bloc in Laos. Minister Yi, one in conversation, of course, with Kuleba of Ukraine this week, emphasised the importance of Russia and China's role in developing and defending Southeast Asia from what it calls interference. And indeed, I think this is just another example of Russia and China posturing as defenders of these member states in order to encourage deeper cooperation and indeed, most crucially, dependence. We also learned today that China will send on the 28th the Chinese government special envoy for Eurasian affairs to Brazil, South Africa and Indonesia to conduct the 4th round of shuttle diplomacy on what it calls the Ukrainian crisis. Evidently, they want to be seen to be the key brokers of any major conversations taking place about peace that might involve Russia and themselves. So I think this should be read as part of that ongoing process. But as we've talked about now for several weeks, I think the sign that there will be an imminent, serious, bringing all sides to the table peace negotiations summit is still a long way off, given the positioning of the two sides and the fact that nothing fundamental still has changed that would bring either side to the table. But obviously, as discussed, this is something that is being more openly expressed within the Ukrainian administration, by Moscow, and indeed by members of the Ukrainian public as well, though I emphasise there is no agreement on what even negotiations should be discussing at this stage, with many, many people still saying that any concessions to Russia would be unacceptable. So a complicated picture. But that's where we are, David, as we go into the Olympics weekend.
Well, thank you very much, Francis. Hamish to Bretton-Gordon, thank you so much for joining us again. A couple of updates from you. Could you talk, I know one thing you wanted to talk about was Putin's meeting with Assad. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Thanks very much for having me on again. It might seem an odd segue into the Assad-Putin meetings in Moscow this week, just to say a little bit about what we've been talking about mostly on the podcast so far, the attack on the infrastructure network in France. And I'm very cautious, like the rest of you, on this, but I think there are a couple of other elements that are worth looking at. I know that the French have suggested that these attacks are looking to create confusion and disrupt the games rather than the mass civilian casualties, and that is interesting. That would perhaps then discount some of the ISIS and Al-Qaeda who conduct terrorist activities in Europe, and particularly in France, over the last couple of years. I think the other thing, picking up on what's been said already, we all know that there are hundreds of Russian agents and their proxies in Europe, and you've already described some of their activities. Without going into details, I have been involved in providing expert advice on the security of the games over the last couple of years. So I have a reasonable feel. And the Russians in particular would know that the centre of Paris is watertight. And when I look at it from a security perspective, these attacks, hundreds of miles apart, all synchronized and sequenced together, this takes a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of planning, which I would surmise is probably beyond some of the smaller, more radical groups that are perhaps being suggested here. So I think we just need to watch this space. But certainly, in my personal view, those people who are going into Paris to do the Olympics, you should not be overly concerned and put off by this. To me, it has achieved what the aims whoever wanted to do it, whoever is eventually responsible. Of course, we've heard nothing from Moscow yet. And of course, if they deny it, then that will be added to the mix. But the segue back to Mr. Putin again, with Assad visiting him in Moscow this week, this is very personal to me, having really from 2013 to 2019 been in and out of Syria, ostensibly trying to working with medical agencies to protect hospitals and medical people, but also looking and finding the evidence of the use of chemical weapons. And Russia became involved in 2015, 2016. And as we've discussed on the pod over the last 2 years, the sort of Syrian playbook is exactly the playbook, or virtually the playbook, that we're seeing, less the drones, that is, that we're seeing in Ukraine at the moment. And the segue is infrastructure. Discussed earlier on the pod how focused Russia is on the infrastructure, but because the Russians believe, as the Syrians believe, that if you cut off the supply of logistics of everything to your adversary, of course in Syria, Assad's adversary were his own people, and that worked. And we've seen similar in Ukraine, where the Russians have directly attacked hospitals. And we discussed in great detail a few weeks ago about the cancer hospital in Kyiv. And we now know, or certainly information coming out of the security services in the UK and US, that the targeting of the hospital was deliberate. I don't think anybody didn't think it was. But in Syria, in fact, the Idlib Health Directorate, who I helped, reported over 1,000 times that hospitals and clinics were attacked. And eventually that subjugated the people, and Assad prevailed. And in my particular area, the use of chemical weapons, to me, Assad is still in power because he used chemical weapons. And certainly in the early days of the Syrian conflict, we in the West rather looked the other way, which is the whole subject of another pod, and I won't go into it. But it is, again, as we've discussed and I've written about in the paper, the extensive use of chemical weapons in Ukraine by the Russians, 3,200 times during the war and over 600 times in the last 4 weeks. And Jimmy Rushton and others have done some fantastic work looking at that. So it was interesting. I think Putin said that the visit of Assad was all about him trying to sort things out in the Middle East, which seemed rather strange. Actually, the Russian activity in the Middle East and its support for the Iranian militias and also the Iranian-sponsored groups like Hezbollah and Hamas have actually made things a great deal worse. And seeing Assad in Moscow slightly seemed to me whether he was actually going to mark Putin's homework, as it were. So I found it particularly distasteful. And the final part of this was, I'm talking about the chemical weapon use, the chloropicrine and the CS gas, which is having such an effect. We are working very hard to try and get the Ukrainians some respirators, gas masks, which will actually nullify that particular capability. But we shall see. And I hope that the new government, having seen that that the old government did eventually, with the Americans and the French, strike Assad's chemical weapons facilities in 2017 and 2018 and brought that to an end. I'm not suggesting that we should be striking Russians moving chloropicrin to the front line, but by giving the Ukrainians some gas masks, that will nullify that particular capability. Over.
Thank you so much, Hamish. Just one more story from you, I think, before we go to our final thoughts. One of the big stories from the past two and a half years has been the use and the evolution of drone warfare. You've been looking at some of the innovations on the British side for combating that in the future. What have you found?
Yes, I think this has been really interesting. And we've discussed in the past about the large laser called Dragonfire, which is meant to be ship-mounted to take out some of the bigger drones. But the MOD announced earlier on in the week that they'd also developed a much smaller laser to be fitted on armoured vehicles, tanks and armoured personnel carriers. And the huge challenge, without wanting to repeat what we've discussed already, is that when you've got thousands and thousands of drones attacking you, but you only have very expensive air defence missiles to take them down, you very quickly run out of your expensive air defence missiles before the enemy runs out of his drones. When an air defence missile can cost a couple of £100,000, if not £1 million, whereas a £500 drone is what you're trying to knock out. So that was a challenge. And when I was with the Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurd military, in the fight with ISIS 2015 to 2017, and ISIS were dropping hand grenades on us from these drones, the only thing we had was small arms fire, and fired lots of thousands of rounds at these drones. Sometimes you knocked them down, sometimes you didn't. So to hear that it would appear that the whole laser-directed direct energy weapons seem to be the way to go. And what the MOD are saying is that these laser weapons can put on the vehicles at minimal cost of a cup of tea, I think they said, which presumably means, well, I don't know, down here in Wiltshire, it probably means £1. Maybe up in London, it's probably £3. But let's say split the difference, £1.50, but not very much. And if you can fire multiple times, and we understand these lasers fire out to about 1,000, 2,000 meters, that you can then really move forward. And everybody's been looking for a defense of the drones. And we've seen on a lot of tanks and armored vehicles, these sort of metal cages put up there, which are all very good, but you don't want the thing to explode, a foot off your vehicle. If you can take it out in the air at 1,000 feet, even better. And it does sound like the answer to the maiden's prayer, or whatever the correct terminology is these days. But again, with military procurement, Ukrainians need this kit on the front line today. And I think, again, with the Dragonfire, the larger laser, and this one, and the Ministry of Defence is saying a year or two, I hope with the review of military capability that the new government are getting in there, one of them is let not be perfection be the enemy of the good, as it were. If the thing's good enough, it's at 80% works, get it out there, use it, and use its capacity in combat to develop it rather than make sure it's perfect. So, yeah, I think it's a really interesting development, but I hope it's a little bit further forward than perhaps the briefings are suggesting. We know how risk averse and how people like to talk these things down. But once you put it in the sort of public domain, as it were, and got everybody excited, one would hope that it's not delayed. So really interesting developments coming out of UK MOD and the defence establishment at Porton Down. But let's hope we realise its capability sooner rather than later.
Thank you so much, James, Francis and Hamish. For many months now, Russian strikes have been targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure, knocking out power stations, plunging civilians into darkness, and forcing the country to live through regular electricity blackouts. To survive the summer and the fast-approaching heating season, the country is looking to decentralise its energy system to ensure people aren't dependent on vulnerable power stations. I spoke to Kyiv Independent reporter Andrea Januta, who's been writing on the transformation of Ukraine's energy. Here's our conversation. Andrea, would you set the scene? What's the current situation for Ukraine's power grid and energy generation?
Well, as I'm sure your listeners know, Ukraine has been in a severe energy crisis for several months now due to severe Russian strikes on the power grid. Since May, we've been having daily disruptive power outages, because many of the power plants that supply the power for the country have been just devastated by Russian missile strikes. Some have been taken completely offline, and some have been greatly reduced in their capacity. We're expecting that in the winter, things will get even worse as power needs spike for heating and other needs. One estimate, for example, is that in the winter, Ukrainians could be facing up to 20 hours of missing power every single day.
Well, let's take a step back just before we talk about the Ukrainian example. How does a country decentralize its energy production in peacetime normally? What do you have to do? How difficult is it? And I know we've talked before about some of the examples you think you can talk through a little bit to show how other people are doing it.
Yeah, so first we should talk about what decentralization is. So power is produced in various power plants in various places, and the idea of decentralization is to generate smaller amounts of energy closer to where it's used, rather in these large centralized hubs like major power plants. A country is not going to fully 100% decentralize anytime soon. For example, the nuclear power plants that provide the largest share of Ukraine's power are still going to be operating. But the idea is to build more flexibility in the grid and more alternatives in case something happens to them. Another thing that sometimes people say is they use the phrase distributed energy. When we look at how other countries decentralize their grid, usually the reasons are for grid flexibility and stability, as well as increasing their share of green energy, so meeting climate targets, meeting decarbonization targets. For one example, after Hurricane Sandy in New York took out much of the city's power, the government realized they need to have more alternatives so that one giant event can't take out all of the emergency services, all the evacuation routes, all of the people's power all at the same time. We saw something similar in Texas after the large winter storms in 2021 resulted in hundreds of deaths. And then Texas as well is trying to create other alternatives and make a more flexible grid.
What kind of challenges do states find when they're attempting to do this?
I think any large infrastructure overhaul is going to come with challenges. You have the same challenges with any project. You have financing, you have planning, you have hooking up new connections to the grid, you have getting the political willpower to do something like this, and making the whole project come together.
Let's talk about Ukraine then. You've set the scene, I think, really nicely, talking about what happens elsewhere in countries at peacetime. Tell us what's happening in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, they are trying to distribute their energy system for a much more existential reason. They either have power or they don't, and they're trying to build as much generation as they can. And they're trying to do it now in a way that's less of a sitting target for Russian missile strikes. But while decentralization is already a very difficult overhaul to do in peacetime, you're rethinking an entire energy system. Doing that under the conditions of a war is even far more challenging. So, for example, one large challenge is that foreign financing is really hard to come by in Ukraine. The amount of investors willing to invest in Ukraine plummeted when the full-scale invasion began. And especially finding investors who will provide financing for energy projects is even more difficult when they know that that's a specific target for Russian threats. Another challenge that they're facing is they simply can't get all of the people and parts necessary to build new systems. So they're looking at building gas-powered turbines, solar panels, wind farms, mini thermal plants. You need to get the parts into the country to build these, and you need people who can install them, who can design the plans. Right now, Ukraine is facing a huge labor shortage because of mobilization, because of people moving abroad, because of people internally displaced. And so finding these people who can carry out the plans is a huge challenge. Additionally, this decentralization plan has been a huge spike in demand for these parts. So all of the different companies and public-private sector trying to build these systems are in competition, raising the prices. So what we're seeing is that projects which in peacetime might not be financially viable at these costs, with these challenges, they're actually going ahead anyway, because there's just such a need to build that power back into the system.
Well, thank you for the detail there. I mean, the big question here is, do we think this will fix the problems that lie ahead in terms of energy shortage during the winter?
They're going to help, but they are not going to fix the issue. These are emergency solutions that they're trying to get in place to reduce the harm as much as they can, but the winter is still going to be very difficult. A lot of these projects that they're building now are going to take years to come online, so they're really looking ahead at trying to build in that resiliency. But the people I spoke with said that it is a question of too little too late, that these projects needed to get started much, much earlier in order to have an effect on the winter.
I mean, you use an example of the city of Kyiv in the west of Ukraine as an example of how this kind of stuff can be done. Would you tell us a little bit about the city, what it did? And because from what I understand, kind of the interesting thing here is all of this started before the outbreak of the full-scale invasion.
Kyiv is interesting because in 2015, they got a new mayor who I spoke with who has a background in renewable energy. And when he took office in 2015, that was a real priority for him. So Kyiv has been one of the cities that is very ahead of the curve in Ukraine for decentralizing, or rather making their power grid much more green. It was back in 2018 when they pledged to be fully decarbonized, fully on renewable resources by 2050. So they've been installing solar panels, they've been installing alternative energy sources, and they've been hosting regular events for their citizens as well about how they can conserve energy and better improve their energy systems, days when they should reduce their power because of high demand on the grid, etc. It was really interesting. One thing that the mayor told me was when he took office, he went touring around Ukraine and other cities in Europe, trying to learn about how they built their energy infrastructure and what he could learn from them. And he said since the blackouts began in the last couple of months, he's had other mayors coming to his city trying to learn from what they've done over the past few years. He recognizes that they had a leg up, they had a head start with many years in terms of building contacts, building education, having teams in place, knowing how to carry things out quickly. So they're very much in a better position. But he's hoping that in having these visitors and talking with other mayors, they can learn from the Kyiv experience and carry those lessons, hopefully carry them out faster.
Andrea, thank you so much for your time. Just to finish then, would you sum up some of your thoughts and what would you want our listeners to go away and realize and think about from your reporting?
What Ukraine is trying to do is already a major rethinking in peacetime, and they're trying to do it with a very fast timeline. They're trying to do it under a huge labor shortage. They're trying to do it under Russian missile strikes. What an expert from Dixie Group, a think tank I spoke with, said was Ukraine is going to make mistakes because of the speed, because of the urgency, because of all the challenges they're facing, but that should be understood as what happens when you try and do such a large project under pressure, and they should have the room to make those mistakes. I've heard a lot of people say that there's a huge opportunity here for Ukraine to lead the charge in green energy, and I think that is absolutely the case, but that's more of a medium-term solution. In the immediate short-term emergency, they're going to have to make other choices, especially under the huge pressure they're in. I think all of the rapid changes happening in Ukraine's energy system give it a real opportunity to be a leader, to find innovative solutions, to really make their system more green. But at the same time, I think people outside Ukraine need to understand the huge pressures they're facing, the huge time pressure, the labor crunch, the missile strikes, and how difficult this is going to be for them. So I think they also need to understand that some of what Ukraine does could be rushed, there could be mistakes, but that's very understandable.
Andrea, thank you so much for your time. Let's move then to our final thoughts. Francis, would you like to go first?
Well, thanks, David. Listeners will know that one of the threads we've talked about for some time now is about the nature of Ukrainian society and how it is fighting this war. Very briefly, and I am very much generalising here, so forgive me if it sounds a bit crass and oversimplistic, but when the war began, you had the central government and it had given the freedom for manoeuvre to the armies and indeed local people in order to respond to the full-scale invasion. And that was, of course, one of the key elements to the early success in the war, was that lower-level dynamism. As the war has gone on, there has been a critique and a criticism that has been made, particularly by senior figures, that the government has not really got a handle in terms of thinking strategically about how best to harness that local drive, with the problem being that when you give incentives and incentivize local peoples, communities, organizations to function independent of the state, that they are all prioritizing themselves, as they would, because they're not connected to everything else, as opposed to thinking more strategically about where resources are required. So just to give one example, let's say that you're a unit or a community organisation that is located in one part of the front. Your priority is getting as much equipment to that part of the front as possible. So you connect with charities, you connect with people abroad, and you say, we need this, that and the other. Now, there may be a group that is actually in far more need of drones and equipment that is further up the line that don't have those connections. So you get people who critique this and say, well, now we need to have the central government that is more in control, that can actually allocate strategically resources. So it's about moving strategically the function of society away from the horizontal to the vertical. That's how it's sometimes, as I say, in a very simplistic term, discussed. And for those who are interested in the reality of that conversation and how it's fleshed out on the ground, I highly recommend listening to the special episode I did reporting on the ambulance deliveries to Ukraine, where I spoke to Brock Bierman, the head of Ukraine Focus, who reflected on this very, very important issue in that podcast. Now, the reason I mention it here is a new report has been published called The Economics of Localizing Aid in Ukraine. It's co-published by the Share Trust, CDP and Refugee International. And the top line in it, and it's a very detailed report for those who I know are many listeners who are interested in this field, hence why I mention it here, is that despite commitments to redirect international assistance to local actors, the localization agenda has seen slow progress globally, with 1.2% of humanitarian funding going directly to local and national actors in 2022. And this trend has been echoed in the response to the Ukraine crisis, where 0.07 of funding has gone directly to local actors. Now, you get some people, and I say I'm not coming at this with a particular argument, I hasten to add. Some people argue that this is a terrible stat because they'll say, well, why not give the money directly to the people who actually can do more, that Ukrainian society has proven itself as being able to not function with the need for all of these different bureaucracies, red tape, which slows things down, makes things more bloated, and as such makes the ability to respond effectively much more challenging. So that's one perspective. Another perspective might say that actually there are proper safeguards in place with you having more filters and red tape and bureaucracy. That's, of course, when you start bringing in the corruption conversation as well. So some people would say, well, actually, this makes sense that things don't go directly to local actors. And another perspective that might be built on that is this idea that actually you want it to be going more to the national central body, the government or its proxies, that then it can distribute the content. And that has been more of the approach that has been adopted, and yet the government has not really proven itself capable of effectively strategizing, many argue, where that is needed to go. So as I say, I'm not putting forward an argument here. I'm simply stating that that is the nature of the conversation. And this report is an interesting contribution to that very important conversation, and very much welcome listeners' perspectives on this. If you are on the ground in Ukraine and are involved in these kind of organizations, whether it be about aid, whether it be about getting drones, soldiers, I'm very interested in the perspective of how things can be actually tangibly improved. We know the problem, but how can things be improved in terms of getting things where things need to be without actually creating new entities, whether it be red tape, bureaucracy, that slow things down and make things actually less effective and impactful than they currently are. So a big debate, David, and I recommend people read this report, which we'll link to in the show notes.
Thank you very much, Francis, for all of that. Hamish, would you like the very final words this week?
Yes, thank you very much. And really sort of please the new government, be bold. for all the time I spent in Syria, the government, and it wasn't just the British government, and didn't really commit except for on a few particular occasions. And when we look at Ukraine, the sort of drip feeding of weaponry into Ukraine over the last 2.5 years of the war, we think about the air defence and the tanks and all the rest of it. Had we been bold at the very beginning, I'm sure we wouldn't be in the same position now. And again, when we're talking about being bold, the ability for the Ukrainians to take out targets beyond their borders of the aircraft that are launching the missiles that are attacking the children's cancer schools, to my mind, it's a no-brainer. So I just hope that moving forward, and I know that they're going to have a defence review and all the rest of it, but be bold and we will get results. And that is my line, really, and line for the weekend. Be bold. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hamish, Francis and James. Thank you all for listening and have a very good afternoon. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload. So if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it is released, do refer to the podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And you can contact us directly on Twitter. You can find our Twitter handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was produced by Rachel Porter, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.